Every day as the sun began to fall, a gray German shepherd named Sadie would appear at the edge of the forest and sit silently watching the cabin of Jack Callahan, a Marine who had buried himself in the mountains to escape his past. She never barked, never begged. She only kept her post like a loyal sentinel on a mission no one else could see. But when the great blizzard came and the snow buried the valley for the first time, she did not appear. And for Jack, that emptiness was more terrifying than the storm itself, because he knew the silence was not safety, but a cry that someone somewhere still needed saving. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you. Amen. The Montana wilderness in late November carried a silence so sharp it seemed to cut the air. The sky stretched pale and vast above the mountains, its gray-blue light bleeding into the frozen peaks. Frost clung to the branches of ponderosa pines, their green made brittle and glassy by the bite of early winter. The wind moved slowly down the valley, a quiet exhale that stirred the snow along the timberline. There was no hum of traffic, no voices carried across distance, no evidence of the world Jack Callahan had abandoned. Only the steady rhythm of nature persisted, the cry of a hawk echoing far off, the low groan of branches under the weight of ice, and the crunch of his boots pressing against the frost-hardened earth. Jack Callahan stood on the porch of his weathered log cabin, arms folded across his broad chest. At 43, his face bore the story of wars fought both overseas and within. Tall and powerfully built from years of military service, his frame still carried the lean muscle of a Marine, though solitude had carved away any softness life might once have given him. His jawline was angular, hardened, shaded by a stubble of dark blonde whiskers streaked with silver. His hair, cropped short in the style of a man who never fully left the discipline of the Corps, carried those same threads of gray. But it was his eyes that revealed the truth of his exile, steel blue, piercing and alert, yet shadowed by a guardedness that kept the world at bay. They were eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. Jack had come here for one reason only, to silence the ghosts that followed him from Afghanistan and Iraq. Ghosts of brothers lost in the dust, of orders that cost lives, of the constant roar of combat that even now could awaken him in the dead of night, sweat freezing on his brow. The world outside, with its chatter and pity and expectations, offered him no peace. So he built his own fortress here in Ironwood Valley, not one of stone or steel, but of solitude and routine. The cabin was simple, functional. One room served every purpose, a narrow cot tucked into a corner, covered by a wool blanket folded with military precision, a wood-burning stove whose iron belly breathed warmth into the space, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, though only one was ever used, and shelves sparsely filled with canned goods, tools, and the barest necessities. No photographs hung on the log walls. No books lay open, no television or radio intruded. Everything was stripped down to essentials, to survival. That morning had begun as all the others did. Jack rose before dawn, his body tuned to an internal clock that no longer cared about the absence of reveille. He pulled on flannel and canvas, his breath visible in the chill. He split wood in the clearing behind the cabin, his axe biting into oak with clean, brutal rhythm. Swing, crack, split, stack. Each stroke was a meditation, a war fought against memory through repetition. He checked the perimeter of his land, 10 acres carved into the forest by stubbornness and his own 2 hands. He walked the boundary in silence, every step measured, scanning like a soldier on patrol. And it was during one of these walks, days earlier, that he had first noticed the dog. At the edge of the timberline, where the forest surrendered to his clearing, a figure had been waiting. A German shepherd mix, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a coat mottled gray and black like weathered stone. Age had frosted the fur around its muzzle, and one ear bore the faint, ragged tear of some old fight. Its amber eyes, sharp and unwavering, fixed on him with a stillness that was almost unnerving. The dog had not barked. It had not begged. It had simply sat, its back straight, its head high, watching as if it had been assigned a duty only it understood. Jack had stared for long minutes, expecting the animal to flee or approach, but it remained rooted, a sentinel carved from shadow and frost. Finally, it turned with slow, deliberate grace and vanished into the woods, melting into the silence as if it had never been. From that day forward, the ritual repeated. Each afternoon, as the sun sank and painted the valley in fire and violet, the dog returned to the same place, the same hour, and took its post. It never failed. It never sought contact. It only watched. Jack named it in his mind Sentinel, because that was what it was, a soldier on watch. And though he told himself he did not care, he found his eyes drifting to the tree line more often. He found himself listening for the faint crunch of paws across frost. He told himself it was nothing, just an animal behaving as animals do. Yet a part of him, the part that had once trusted comrades to cover his blind spots in the desert, felt a strange comfort in its consistency. Now, standing on the porch, Jack exhaled into the sharp mountain air, watching the mist of his breath curl and fade. Across the clearing, as if summoned by thought, Sentinel emerged from the trees. The dog's form was stark against the white of snow and the dark trunks of pine. Its coat caught the late sunlight, streaks of gray shining silver, darker patches shadowing its ribs. Its eyes glowed with intelligence, reflecting the fading light. It moved with unhurried discipline, each step measured, until it reached the familiar spot at the clearing's edge. There it lowered its haunches, posture erect, gaze locked on Jack's cabin. The Marine and the dog regarded each other across the frozen ground. Two soldiers without orders, bound by duty to nothing and yet unable to let go of vigilance. Jack's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching. He told himself to look away. He told himself it meant nothing. Yet his chest felt tighter, as if the silent presence across the clearing pressed against him more than the wind ever could. As the light dimmed and shadows lengthened, Sentinel remained. An hour passed. Only when the valley sank fully into twilight did the dog rise, stretch with quiet dignity, and slip once more into the woods. The silence closed in behind it. Jack remained on the porch long after, staring at the empty space where it had been. His heart beat too loud in the quiet. He rubbed his temples, angry at himself for caring, angry at the way this nameless animal had breached the walls he had built so carefully. Inside the cabin, he stoked the stove until it glowed, heat rolling against the log walls. He sat at the table with a tin mug of bitter coffee, his thoughts circling like vultures. He remembered faces, Sergeant Miller, Corporal Diaz, young men who had trusted him and never come home. He remembered the roar of explosions, the spray of sand, the moments he had chosen one path over another and paid for it with someone else's blood. He had built this life to escape all of that, to keep the world away, to need nothing and no one. And yet, as the night deepened, he found himself glancing toward the window, searching the dark tree line for a glint of amber eyes. He found himself waiting, as though Sentinel's silent vigil had become part of his own survival. Jack cursed under his breath, drained the last of his coffee, and forced himself to bed. He lay stiff beneath the wool blanket, listening to the mountain silence. But the silence was no longer empty. It was inhabited, filled with the echo of a presence at the edge of the woods, a reminder that even in exile, one was never truly unseen. As sleep pulled him under, Jack dreamed not of explosions or blood, but of a gray figure seated against the tree line, calm and unwavering, guarding a fortress of solitude he had once believed impenetrable. The next morning dawned cold and pale over Ironwood Valley, the sky a wash of faded pearl streaked with lavender as the sun struggled to rise above the peaks. Frost silvered every blade of grass in Jack Callahan's clearing, making the land glitter like it had been scattered with diamonds. The stove inside the cabin had burned low during the night, and the chill clung stubbornly to the logs. Jack, wrapped in his flannel jacket, stepped out onto the porch, his breath puffing white in the air. He expected nothing new, nothing unusual. His life was built on ritual, and ritual allowed no surprises. But on that morning, the rhythm shifted. At the end of his driveway, little more than a rutted dirt track choked with ice, stood a figure bundled against the cold. She was holding something in her arms, and beside her was a boy, thin and restless, clutching a paper bag. Jack paused, his jaw tightening. Strangers were rare out here, and rarer still were those who came willingly. The woman noticed him and raised a gloved hand in greeting. She was in her mid-30s, of medium height and slender build, though the wear of life was visible in the set of her shoulders and the faint lines around her hazel eyes. Maggie Turner had auburn-brown hair pulled into a practical bun under a wool cap, and her cheeks were pinked with the bite of the cold. Her clothes were plain and patched in places, an old green coat, boots scuffed by years of use. But there was a quiet dignity about her, the kind carried by people who had been forced to weather storms greater than weather itself. Her husband had died in a mining collapse 2 winters ago, a fact the small town whispered about with pity. That tragedy had carved something permanent into Maggie's manner, resilience edged with sorrow. She smiled when she needed to, not because the world made her smile. The boy beside her was Eli Turner, 10 years old, small for his age but wiry in the way of children who climb fences and dash through backyards. His hair was a tangle of chestnut curls that refused discipline, and his wide green eyes carried both mischief and hunger for stories. He wore a jacket too big for him, the sleeves rolled up to his wrists, and his boots were hand-me-downs with new laces. Eli's curiosity seemed to radiate from him in the way he fidgeted, eyes darting between Jack, the cabin, and the woods, as though the entire valley hid secrets meant only for him. Jack studied them for a moment longer before stepping down from the porch. His instinct was to turn them away, keep his distance, but Maggie spoke first. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," she called, her voice carrying the polite warmth of someone determined not to be a burden. "Sorry to trouble you. I heard you're handy with tools. My roof's leaking something fierce, and I could use a bit of help if you've got the time." Her words struck him like a hammer on cold iron. Help! The one thing he had sworn off, the tether he had cut by coming here. Jack's expression didn't soften, but he gave a slow nod. "Roof's not forgiving this time of year," he said, his tone clipped. "Ice'll crack it worse if you leave it." Relief flickered in her smile. She adjusted the basket in her arms. Jars of jam, wrapped loaves of bread, small tokens of barter. "I can't pay you much. Just thought I'd bring something by so it's not charity." Jack's eyes lingered on the bread, then on her face. "I'll take a look," he muttered. Eli piped up before Maggie could answer. "Is it true you live out here all alone? Don't you get scared?" Jack turned his gaze on the boy. "No," he said simply. The boy blinked, then grinned, undeterred. "What about the dog?" Eli asked suddenly, his voice hushed with excitement. "The one in the woods. I saw him last week when Mama came this way. He sits out there like he's guarding you." "Do you know why he does that?" Jack stiffened. He hadn't told anyone about Sentinel, hadn't spoken the dog's name aloud. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, unwilling to grant the boy more than silence. Maggie frowned gently. "Eli," she said softly, a note of reproach, "don't bother Mr. Callahan with stories." "They're not stories," Eli insisted, his green eyes sparking. "That dog knows something. You can see it." Jack cut the conversation short. "I'll bring my tools tomorrow," he said, turning back toward the cabin. "Roof first. Talk later." He left them standing at the edge of his yard, the boy whispering questions into the cold air while the mother tried to hush him. Inside, Jack pressed his palms against the table, breathing slow and heavy. The intrusion rattled him more than he cared to admit. He had built a fortress of silence, and already the world was creeping back through cracks he hadn't noticed. Maggie's voice, Eli's curiosity, even the smell of bread she'd left behind on his porch. They lingered. That afternoon, Sentinel appeared, as always, on schedule, as if the dog were immune to interruptions of routine. Jack sat on the steps, his axe resting against his boot, and watched the gray figure take its seat at the clearing's edge. Sentinel's amber eyes locked on the cabin, steady, unblinking. But today, Jack's thoughts were not only on the dog. They circled around Maggie's tired smile, the way she carried her burdens without complaint, and Eli's wild, unguarded curiosity, two people who, against his will, had crossed the boundary he had drawn. And then there was Sentinel, a creature as disciplined and consistent as any Marine he had ever known. It appeared at the exact same time, left at the exact same moment, with the unwavering purpose of a soldier. Jack narrowed his eyes. The dog wasn't a stray, not in the ordinary sense. It wasn't driven by hunger or fear. Its watchfulness was something else entirely, something intentional. He could feel it in his bones, the way soldiers feel an ambush before it comes. Still, he refused to admit aloud what the boy had guessed. There was something about Sentinel, yes, but admitting it meant accepting connection. Accepting meant risking loss. And Jack Callahan had lost enough. The next day, He walked to Maggie's house in the small town on the valley's edge. It was a modest clapboard structure, its white paint peeling, the roof patched with tar paper that sagged under the weight of snow. He set his toolbox down without ceremony. Maggie opened the door, apron dusted with flour, and thanked him quietly. Eli bounded past her, eager to show Jack where the roof leaked. As Jack climbed the ladder and set to work, he could hear Eli's voice below, firing questions. "Did you fight in a war? Did you ever get shot? Did you ever see someone die?" Each question landed like a stone thrown at water, rippling memories he worked hard to bury. Maggie scolded Eli gently, but Jack answered none of them. He focused on hammer, nail, and tar, his hands working in cold precision. Later, as he finished, Maggie handed him a cup of steaming coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out. "I'm grateful," she said softly. "Since David passed, it's been harder. Eli needs more than I can give some days. And this place, well, it breaks faster than I can fix it." Jack took the mug, the heat searing his hands, and nodded once. He said nothing, but her words planted themselves in him all the same. That evening, back at his cabin, Sentinel appeared again. Jack found himself speaking into the silence, his voice low, as though confessing to the dog. "You keep showing up," he muttered, "like you've got orders. What's your mission, huh?" The dog tilted its head slightly but made no sound. It simply sat, still as stone, eyes fixed on the man who had spent years convincing himself he needed no one. For the first time since he'd come to Ironwood Valley, Jack felt the walls of his solitude flex. The boy's questions, the woman's quiet strength, and the dog's unwavering vigil had stirred something he didn't want to name. He clenched his fists, angry at the weakness. Connection meant danger. Attachment meant pain. He had promised himself he would never feel either again. Yet the clearing told a different story, one he could not ignore forever. The wind carried a sharper bite as December pressed itself onto Ironwood Valley. The sun dipped early behind the jagged ridges, leaving the world in long stretches of dusk before true night came. Jack Callahan had settled into a rhythm he did not ask for but could not shake. Mornings of work, afternoons of silence, evenings watching for the gray figure that arrived like clockwork. Sentinel never failed to appear. At precisely the same hour, the dog emerged from the trees, its fur mottled silver and black, its posture unyielding. It would sit in the same place, stare at the cabin, and leave only when the last of the light was gone. Jack told himself he didn't care. Yet his eyes always found the tree line, searching for the shape of the soldier dog, and when it wasn't there, his chest constricted as though some necessary organ were missing. He was being drawn into something he did not want, connection, and it terrified him. That terror had its roots in nights like this one. The stove's fire burned low, casting dull amber light across the cabin walls. Jack lay on his cot, arms crossed over his chest as if trying to pin himself to the present. Sleep came late and violent. In his dreams, sand whipped across his face, the roar of an explosion split the air. He was back in Helmand Province, back in the patrol where Sergeant Miller had gone down, the patrol where Jack had chosen to push forward instead of retreat. He saw Miller's face again, eyes wide with pain, and Corporal Diaz screaming for a medic who never came. Jack tried to move, but his legs were made of stone. Smoke, fire, screaming, the world collapsed into chaos. He woke with a strangled gasp, sweat freezing against his temples. His breath came hard and uneven, chest rising like a drowning man's. For a long moment he didn't know where he was. Then he turned his head toward the window. Moonlight poured across the clearing, sharp and pale, and there, at the edge of the trees, sat Sentinel. The dog's form was rigid against the frost, ears pricked, amber eyes glowing faintly in the silver light. It did not move, did not blink. It was as if the animal itself barred the way to those nightmares, a silent guard keeping the ghosts from stepping across the threshold. Jack pressed a hand over his eyes, torn between relief and anger. He hated weakness, and yet seeing the dog there steadied his heart in a way no weapon ever had. "You don't know me," he whispered into the dark, but deep inside, he feared the dog knew him too well. Days later, the valley fell under a gray sky heavy with the promise of snow. Jack was chopping wood when he heard the hurried crunch of footsteps on the frozen path. Maggie Turner appeared, her cheeks flushed, breath ragged. "Jack!" she called. Her voice trembled, not with fear but urgency. Eli's gone missing. He was supposed to be in the yard, but when I looked, he wasn't there. Jack dropped the axe, instincts kicking in before thought. His eyes narrowed. Which way? Maggie pushed hair from her face with a trembling hand. Toward the woods. He's been talking about that dog. He wanted to see if it would come closer. Her voice broke with frustration. I told him not to wander, but he's just a boy. Jack grabbed his coat and rifle. He didn't need to ask more. The forest swallowed the careless quickly, especially with snow on the ground. He followed Maggie toward the tree line, boots breaking the crusted frost, rifle slung over his shoulder. They called Eli's name, voices echoing thin and brittle through the pines. The boy did not answer. Maggie's worry grew with every step, her hazel eyes darting left and right, her gloved hands twisting together. Jack kept his face hard, but each moment without an answer carved deeper into him. He had lost enough men in the desert. He would not lose a boy to these woods. After half an hour of searching, Jack halted, raising a hand for silence. A sound reached him, a faint bark. Not frantic, not wild, but sharp and precise. Maggie froze. That's him? Jack shook his head slowly. No, that's the dog. They followed the sound, weaving through thickets and low-hanging branches. The forest closed around them, shadows shifting like old memories. And then, in a small clearing, Sentinel stood. The dog's coat was rimed with frost, but its eyes were alive with purpose. It stood at a narrow path between trees, tail low, gaze fixed on Jack. When Jack stepped forward, the dog turned, trotted 10 paces down the path, then stopped, looking back. Maggie's breath caught. It's leading us. Jack felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the weather. Still, he moved. The dog repeated the motion, walk ahead, pause, glance back, until at last Jack heard another sound, a child's whimper. He quickened his pace, pushing through a cluster of pines, and there was Eli, crouched beside a fallen log, hugging his knees, his face streaked with tears and cold. Eli looked up, eyes wide. I tried to find him. I thought if I followed the prints, he'd let me see him closer, but I got lost. Maggie rushed to him, pulling him into her arms. Relief trembled through her voice. Don't you ever do that again, Eli Turner. You hear me? Jack knelt nearby, his gaze flicking to Sentinel. The dog stood a few feet away, still as stone, its mission complete. For a long moment, Jack locked eyes with it, something unspoken passing between man and beast. Then Sentinel turned and slipped into the forest, vanishing once more. Later, after Jack walked Maggie and Eli back to their house, he stood alone in the clearing, staring at the path the dog had taken. His heart beat heavy in his chest. The boy's words echoed in his mind. That dog knows something. You can see it. For the first time, Jack admitted the truth to himself. Sentinel wasn't just wandering, wasn't just habit. There was intent in its every move, purpose in its every watch. Dogs didn't stand guard for nothing. Which meant there was a story here, something hidden in these woods, something tied to the animal's discipline. And if there was one thing Jack Callahan knew from his years of service, it was this. Soldiers didn't keep watch unless there was something or someone worth protecting. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. The morning sky was heavy with bruised clouds, the light dim even at noon, as if the sun had given up trying to reach Ironwood Valley. The air carried a sharp metallic taste, that peculiar warning that always came before a blizzard, and the pines along the ridge groaned as wind tested their strength. Jack Callahan split wood faster than usual, his axe striking in relentless rhythm, the sharp cracks swallowed quickly by the rising howl of the wind. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat and survival, told him this would not be an ordinary storm. By late afternoon, snow had begun to fall in sheets, thick and unyielding. It clung to his jacket, collected in his hair, stung his cheeks like tiny shards of glass. Jack stacked the last of the firewood by his cabin and glanced, as he always did, to the tree line. The clearing was empty. No gray figure emerged from the shadows. Sentinel, who had never once missed the ritual, was absent. Jack frowned, scanning the woods longer than he cared to admit. The only movement came from the swirling snow. As dusk deepened, the absence grew heavier, more suffocating than the storm itself. Jack sat by the window, mug of black coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the clearing. His chest felt hollow. Sentinel had become part of his routine, part of the fortress he claimed was unbreachable. Now, with that piece missing, the walls cracked. For the first time in years, Jack felt something he hated most: uncertainty mixed with longing. The storm roared through the valley by nightfall. Wind clawed at the cabin, rattling the shutters, piling snow against the door. Jack added logs to the stove, trying to focus on the fire, but his thoughts circled back to Sentinel. Where was the dog? Had it found shelter? Was it hurt? The questions gnawed at him until he stood abruptly, pacing like a caged animal. A sudden pounding at the door startled him. He pulled it open against the gale, and Maggie Turner stood there, snow plastered to her hair, her cheeks raw from the cold. Her hazel eyes were wide, her lips trembling not from fear but exhaustion. "Jack!" she shouted over the wind. "We've lost power. The lines are down. The stove's gone cold, and Eli, he's freezing. I didn't know where else to go." Jack ushered her inside quickly, slamming the door against the storm's fury. Maggie brushed snow from her coat, her hands shaking. She looked smaller without the composure she usually carried, her strength tested by the merciless weather. "I hated to ask," she admitted, voice softer now, "but Eli's all I've got. I can't let him go through this alone." Jack didn't hesitate. He pulled on his heavier parka and grabbed a lantern. "Stay here. I'll bring him back." Maggie's hand caught his sleeve. "Be careful. The road's gone. You'll have to cut across the ridge." Her eyes searched his, and for a moment she looked less like a neighbor and more like someone desperately trusting a man she barely knew. The trek through the storm was brutal. Snowdrifts rose past his knees, the wind shrieked in his ears, and every step felt like a battle against an invisible enemy. Jack lowered his head, pushing forward with the stubbornness of a Marine on one last mission. At last, the faint outline of Maggie's house came into view, its windows dark, the roof buried under white. Inside he found Eli curled under blankets, his small body shivering. The boy's green eyes lit up when Jack entered. "You came," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "Mama said you would." Jack crouched beside him, checking the child's pulse and skin as instinctively as if he were back on the battlefield. Eli was cold, but not yet in danger. Jack bundled him in an extra coat and lifted him into his arms. The boy was feather light, his head resting against Jack's shoulder, his breath shallow. Back at the cabin, warmth enveloped them. Maggie pulled Eli close to the fire, rubbing his hands to restore circulation. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Jack. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured. He only nodded, retreating to the window, staring again into the storm. But even with Maggie and Eli safe, his unease did not fade. The absence pressed harder, suffocating. Sentinel had not come. Jack gripped the window frame until his knuckles whitened, his body tense with decision. He had told himself solitude was survival, that ties meant loss. And yet, now that the dog was gone, it felt like losing something vital. The storm battered harder. Maggie placed a hand on his arm. "You've done enough. Don't go back out there tonight. No one would survive long in this." But Jack shook his head slowly. His voice was low, steady. "That dog has been out there every day, every single day." "Not today. There's a reason." Maggie's brow furrowed. "You'll risk your life for a stray?" He met her gaze, his steel blue eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, desperation mixed with resolve. "Not a stray," he said. "A soldier." Before she could argue, he pulled on his gloves and strapped the rifle to his back. The cabin door groaned against the wind as he forced it open. The storm struck him like a physical blow, snow blinding, air burning his lungs. He paused for a single breath, then stepped off the porch into the chaos. Each stride was war. Snow reached his thighs in places, drifts threatening to swallow him. The wind screamed like mortar fire and ice cut his face raw. Yet the physical agony steadied him. It was a fight he could understand, something real and immediate, unlike the intangible war inside his head. He pressed forward, moving from tree to tree, each trunk a brief reprieve from the onslaught. Somewhere ahead, in the white fury, he imagined the shape of gray fur against the snow, amber eyes watching. Sentinel had never abandoned post without cause. Jack would find out why, even if it killed him. And with that conviction burning like a coal inside, Jack pushed deeper into the storm, the fortress of solitude left far behind. The storm had become a living thing, a white leviathan that swallowed sound and sight alike. Jack Callahan pushed forward through the blizzard, his body aching from the relentless force of the wind. Each step was a test of willpower, his boots sinking deep into snowdrifts that threatened to trap him. The world had narrowed to the circle of light from his lantern, a trembling glow against the storm's fury. His breath came in sharp clouds, his chest heaving, but the thought of Sentinel alone in this chaos kept his legs moving. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. Time lost all meaning in the storm. Then there. Beneath the lantern's glow, Jack saw the faint impression of paw prints. Oval shapes pressed into the snow, already filling, fragile ghosts of movement. His heart jolted with sudden adrenaline. Sentinel's trail. He followed, his pace quickening, each new print a beacon pulling him deeper into the storm-shrouded woods. The prints led him to a slope where the trees thickened, their trunks bent under heavy snow. Jack ducked beneath low branches, his coat brushing frost, until the light of his lantern caught on something unnatural, a straight line cutting across the chaos of branches. He squinted, stepping closer. It was the corner of a roof, nearly buried under snow, the logs dark with age, an abandoned cabin. Jack's instincts surged with caution. The place looked forsaken, its windows dark, roof sagging beneath the weight of years and storms. The door was swollen with ice, nearly fused to the frame. But there, at the threshold lay Sentinel. The dog's gray and black coat was dusted with snow, its body curled but head lifted, ears alert even in exhaustion. Its amber eyes caught the lantern light, glowing faintly, and beside it, half buried in blankets, was the shape of a man. Jack's heart hammered. He forced the door open, wood groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The cold hit him like a fist. The cabin was deathly still, air so frigid it seemed to cut into bone. Sentinel shifted aside, but not far, keeping close to the figure it guarded. The man lying on the cot was elderly, perhaps close to 90. His face was lined with decades, skin pale with the bluish tint of cold. His hair, what remained of it, was wispy white, damp with melted frost. He wore an old flannel shirt and trousers, his body covered with rough wool blankets, but they had done little to stave off the deadly chill. Jack crouched, pressing fingers to the man's neck. A pulse, weak, thread-like, but there. "God damn," Jack muttered under his breath, relief flooding him. He turned to Sentinel. "You brought me here." The dog did not move, but its gaze remained fixed on Jack as if waiting for judgment. Jack set down his lantern and switched to survival mode. He stripped off his gloves, his hands steady with the mechanical focus of training. He pulled the man's blankets tighter, tucking them in, then unzipped his own coat and draped part of it over the man to share warmth. He struck a fire in the cold hearth with practiced movements, coaxing the flames to life. Smoke billowed, then cleared, the crackle of fire slowly filling the dead silence. The old man stirred faintly, lips trembling as if to form words. Jack leaned closer. "Easy," he said. "Stay still. You're not dead yet." The man's eyes fluttered open. They were pale blue, clouded by age but not devoid of fire. His voice came in a rasp, brittle as old paper. "Sadie, is she here?" Jack glanced at Sentinel. "If you mean that dog, yeah, she's here." The old man's cracked lips curved into the faintest smile. His hand, knotted with veins and age spots, shifted weakly, brushing against the dog's fur. Sentinel leaned into it, eyes softening. The sight pierced Jack unexpectedly, a lump forming in his throat. He pressed for details, keeping the man talking to hold him awake. "What's your name, old-timer?" The man swallowed, his voice thin. "Harold. Harold Green." Jack studied him. Harold's face, though ravaged by time, carried the rugged lines of someone who had lived outdoors, cheeks once carved by sun and wind, jaw still square, though softened by age. His frame beneath the blankets was frail now, but Jack could picture him decades earlier. Broad shoulders, steady aim, a man of the woods. Harold coughed, his voice breaking. "My wife, she loved these mountains, died 10 years ago, buried up the ridge. Sadie was her dog." His eyes flicked to Sentinel with a devotion so deep Jack could feel it radiating. After Eleanor passed, Sadie kept watch, always at the clearing, always on the rock, guarding the memory. Jack's chest tightened. He glanced at Sentinel again. The dog Sadie sat by Harold's side, her body taut even in exhaustion, her eyes unwavering. She was not just a stray. She was a soldier guarding a fallen comrade, loyal to the end. And now Jack faced a choice. The storm raged outside. He could walk away, return to the fragile fortress of solitude he had built. He could leave Harold to fate, tell himself the old man had lived his years. It would be safer, cleaner. No attachments, no ties. That was the code that had kept him alive. But then Harold's hand slipped from the dog's fur, his body trembling with cold, and Jack saw not just an old man, but a reflection of himself. A man haunted by memory, bound by loyalty, waiting for someone, anyone, to step forward. Jack clenched his jaw. The soldier in him roared back to life. He pulled his coat tighter around Harold, fed the fire more wood, and began checking for injuries. A bruise darkened Harold's hip, but no breaks. Exposure was the true enemy. Jack worked methodically, rubbing Harold's limbs to restore circulation, speaking in a low, firm voice. "You're not dying tonight, old man, not while I'm here." Hours passed in that cabin, marked by the crackle of fire and Harold's shallow breathing. Jack found himself talking, not much, but enough. He told Harold about the storm, about Maggie and Eli waiting safe. He even admitted, in clipped phrases, that he'd tried to bury his past in these mountains. Harold listened, his eyes heavy but attentive. At one point, Harold murmured, "You've been carrying ghosts." Jack stiffened. "Don't we all?" Silence followed, broken only by the sound of Sadie's tail thumping once against the floor, a quiet affirmation of life. By dawn, the storm had calmed, leaving the world outside buried under a pristine blanket of snow. Jack sat stiff-backed, exhaustion pulling at his muscles, but Harold's breathing had steadied. The old man would live. Jack looked at Sadie. The dog's eyes met his, and for the first time there was no barrier between them. They were two soldiers, both bound by duty, both carrying scars. Jack reached out slowly, laying his hand against the dog's head. Sadie did not pull away. In that moment, Jack understood. He had not just saved Harold Green. He had stepped across a line he thought forever closed, choosing once again to be more than a man hiding from the world. He had chosen to act like a Marine. Winter loosened its grip on Ironwood Valley slowly, like an old soldier reluctant to release his post. The snow retreated in patches, revealing brown grass pressed flat beneath its weight, and the rivers swelled with meltwater, rushing faster with each day. The pines shook off their icy burden, needles dark and wet, dripping in the pale sunlight of March. For weeks after the blizzard, Jack Callahan had kept a fire burning in both his cabin and the abandoned one he now visited daily. But the second cabin was no longer abandoned. It was alive again, inhabited by Harold Green, whose frail body was gradually reclaiming strength. Harold sat most mornings near the small window of his cabin, wrapped in a quilt that Maggie Turner had stitched together from spare fabric. The quilt, a patchwork of faded blues and browns, warmed more than just his body. It reminded him that he had not been left to fade into the woods. His pale eyes still clouded with age, but a sharpness returned to them day by day, especially when he looked at Sadie. The dog rarely left his side now, padding between his bed and the hearth with a quiet dignity, her once rigid soldier's posture softening into something freer. Jack had taken it upon himself to see that Harold recovered properly. He brought venison he had hunted, carried wood from his own store, and repaired the sagging roof so the old man would not be crushed under another storm. Maggie visited too, her presence brightening the dim interior. She carried jars of preserved fruit and bread loaves, her auburn hair shining when sunlight caught it, her hazel eyes softening when she spoke to Harold. Her son Eli often came bounding in behind her, cheeks flushed from running, his green eyes wide with curiosity, peppering Harold with questions about the past. Harold indulged him, his voice gravelly but patient. He told stories of the forest as it had been 50 years ago, of the deer trails and the creeks that once ran clearer, of hunting trips with his wife Eleanor. He spoke of her gently, like every word was a fragile glass ornament he feared might shatter. But when he did, his face softened, lines of grief bending into something closer to peace. Eli adored every word, and perhaps more than the stories, he adored Sadie. The boy often curled up beside her, his small hands buried in her thick coat, whispering secrets only a child would think to share with a dog. Sadie tolerated him with patient stillness, her amber eyes glowing like embers in the firelight. Eli told his mother one night, "She's a real guardian, Mama. She's my guard too." Maggie smiled, brushing his curls back. "Then maybe she's everyone's guardian now." For Jack, spring came differently. It seeped into him not through the changing weather, but through the slow erosion of his walls. He had built his cabin as a fortress against the world, against memory, against the weight of loss. But now, with Harold recovering, Maggie visiting, Eli laughing, and Sadie no longer just a distant figure on the edge of the clearing, the fortress felt less like a prison. His days became filled not only with work, but with company, with voices other than his own echoing in the silence. Maggie noticed it before he did. One afternoon, while Jack repaired Harold's cabin steps, she leaned against the porch post, arms folded. Her cheeks were rosy from the brisk air, strands of auburn hair escaping her bun. She studied him with quiet curiosity. "You're different, you know," she said softly. Jack straightened, his steel blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Different how?" "You don't look so much like a man waiting to disappear." She tilted her head. "You look like someone choosing to stay." Her words struck something deep, but Jack said nothing. He returned to his hammer, though his grip on it had softened. Later, as he walked back to his own cabin, her words followed him like a shadow. Harold, too, had noticed the change. One evening, after Eli had fallen asleep beside the fire with Sadie at his feet, Harold looked at Jack. His pale face was etched with wisdom earned through hardship. "You remind me of myself after Eleanor died," Harold said quietly. "I thought the world had ended. But Sadie, she kept me tethered. You've been running from your ghosts, son. Maybe it's time to let them rest." Jack stared at the old man, the firelight flickering across his scarred features. He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked at Sadie, whose amber eyes met his steadily, as if the dog knew more about him than he wanted to admit. The final thaw of spring came in April, when the valley transformed. Grass pushed green shoots through the thawing soil, and wildflowers braved the chill, scattering color across the slopes. The river near Maggie's house swelled with a roar, breaking ice into shards that spun away downstream. On one particularly bright morning, the group gathered outside Harold's cabin. Harold, leaning heavily on a cane Jack had fashioned, took his first steps outdoors since the storm. His shoulders were stooped, but his spirit seemed lighter, his eyes drinking in the mountains like a man seeing them anew. Sadie trotted ahead, her tail wagging with rare ease, pausing every few steps to glance back at him. Maggie walked beside Harold, steadying him when he faltered, her face glowing with encouragement. Eli darted ahead, laughing, his boots splashing through shallow meltwater. Jack lingered at the back, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching them with an expression he barely recognized in himself. It was something close to belonging. When Harold reached a small ridge, he stopped to catch his breath, then looked out across the valley, his pale blue eyes filled with quiet reverence. "Eleanor used to love this view," he said, voice carrying in the crisp air. "She'd sit right there on that rock and say the mountains always looked like they were standing guard. I suppose Sadie took it to heart." Jack felt something shift inside him. He looked at Sadie, then at Maggie and Eli, then at Harold standing against the horizon. He realized he was no longer the last man in his fortress. The walls had fallen, but instead of destruction, there was life beyond them. That evening, as the sun sank and painted the valley gold, Jack sat on Harold's porch steps. Sadie rested her head on his boot, her breathing slow and steady. Eli sat beside him, talking about how one day he wanted to learn to hunt like Harold, to be strong like Jack. Maggie rocked quietly in the chair nearby, her hazel eyes soft with a rare ease, her hands folded over her lap. Harold dozed in the quilt, his face calm. Jack looked at them all and understood what he had been given. Not soldiers, not comrades bound by orders, but something rarer, a family built not by blood, but by loyalty, grief, and survival. Sadie had not only saved Harold, she had saved Jack. She had drawn him back from the edge of solitude and shown him there could still be warmth, still be connection. The Marine who had come to Ironwood Valley to escape the world now found himself, for the first time in years, choosing to stay in it. And as twilight fell, Jack whispered, almost to himself, "Looks like you guarded me too, girl." Sadie's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a quiet acknowledgement in the fading light. In the end, Jack discovered that solitude was not strength, and walls could never protect a wounded heart. What saved him was not the silence of the mountains, but the loyalty of a dog, the love of a family, and the reminder that even in our loneliest seasons, we are never truly abandoned. Sadie's watch was more than a dog's duty. It was a message for all of us. There is always someone or something guarding us, even when we cannot see it. In our own daily lives, it is easy to retreat behind walls, to believe we must face everything alone. But like Jack, we can find healing when we allow others in, when we open the door to kindness, loyalty, and faith. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of hope and redemption. And if you believe in the quiet guardians who watch over us, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones.